The creation of a good original video game is not an easy undertaking. There's thousands of factors to take into account. From the way any player must feel at ease with the controls and subtly introduced into gameplay skills without ever losing interest in the game itself, to managing a great experience in whatever way the player chooses to play, while balancing a suitable challenge that doesn't feel too easy or unfairly hard. The solution for all of this is, of course, good design. From level design, gameplay inputs, and even the sound direction, all of these elements have to exist in a perfect synergy so that a wonderful experience can be crafted. From this come elements that are so well thought out and pulled off that their iconicity and recognition leads to a fair share of legitimate copycatting. This happens in every art form. Specific ways to shoot a movie, a catchy beat in a song, a narrative style in a book. All of the elements that exist in today's commercial entertainment come from a long line of influential elements that just stuck around. Familiar things like boss fights and health bars are common because games set them up as a standard. But there are more specific elements in games that sometimes catch on, for better or for worse. And they become trends in the industry. Easy ways to make sure a game will be enjoyed by people, because it has the same thing people liked in that popular game. It'll be easier for everyone to naturally adapt to such an element and feel like they're great at it from the start. An entire hurdle is seemingly surpassed, sacrificing that little bit of originality along the way. But just like some movies use certain popular elements in extremely lackluster ways sometimes, games fall into this as well, and one of the reasons for the lack of originality and repetition in the industry today is precisely this. Many popular games use elements that are tried, true, and popular to their detriment. Let's look at a particular prominent example, that of the Arkham combat. Batman Arkham Asylum is one of the greatest examples of how to take a well-known property and create a quality game out of it. In a time when the industry was filled with horrible superhero games, the vastly superior Arkham series was a big hit. One of the reasons being its original and innovative combat gameplay. Arkham Combat slightly automatized fighting enemies expertly as Batman, while still giving the player direct control over the fight. At first, the player was given two simple inputs, to attack and counter. Switching between two buttons at a time was easy, but got harder more quickly as enemies would start to swarm in. As more types of enemies appeared, this required completely different button presses, and the player would have to make lightning-fast decisions about their strategy. Alongside the use of a few gadgets, this made the combat have the exact amount of depth it required, while still being entirely based around two buttons. And in a time when hand-to-hand combat in games wasn't really that good, this element was considered a blessing for most developers. Versions of it ended up featuring in most games with combat, like Mad Max, Sleeping Dogs, Assassin's Creed, Amazing Spider-Man, Uncharted, Shadow of Mordor, etc., etc. This seems like it's great, right? Not exactly. Putting aside the fact that everybody else just stopped trying to make great combat systems and went with the flow, no game has actually made the combat as good as the Arkham series, and many completely failed to implement it in a meaningful way, using it as an easy solution without balancing it accordingly. Using Shadow of Mordor as an example, while Arkham offered different enemies with different weaknesses, all of the enemies in Mordor can be dodged with the flipping ability, which basically gives the player an invincibility button as long as it's being mashed. In a game where most of the gameplay is combat, this is a big flaw. On to another example, the well-known regenerative health in shooters. Back when Bungie was developing the first Halo for the original Xbox, they had a problem. The analog sticks of a console controller did not provide enough control for fast-paced shooters at the time. making them harder to play with limited movement. The answer was to design the game around these controls, while having it play with as much frantic action as any other first-person shooter. The feeling was achieved. One of the solutions to maintain the level of challenge was to make the main character's health, namely the energy shields, recharge whenever there was no damage being taken. This made the gameplay fast and fluid, and the player always on the move. See, this worked, because Halo is designed to be just as free with its movement and complexity as Quake. But the characters move like big heavy tanks, hitting hard and making use of colorful bouncy bullets to keep the dynamic interesting. Recharging health makes sense within its context. Thing is, as soon as Halo took off, shooters started using the rechargeable health mechanic as a standardized element, until every single one of them had it. And just like with Arkham Combat, it was badly adapted. Simplifying the health bar and turning it into a bloody screen element that makes it harder to see as you lose health works great conceptually, but makes the player less willing to make riskier moves while having lower health, forcing the experience into a constant shoot from cover game, which is entirely counterintuitive to what the recharging health element originally meant to the game. And yet another popular element can be blamed for this in shooters. In Resident Evil 4, Shinji Mikami successfully translated his fixed camera control formula into an over-the-shoulder perspective, turning the game into an action shooter. Unlike other shooters, you had to aim the gun with the left trigger before you can shoot with the right one. Along this, players used the running mechanic to move around, and when encountering enemies, they'd stop and carefully aim. This formula ended up being followed by first-person shooters en masse. See, in past shooters, the player would move quickly and shoot at the same time, strafing around enemies in order to skillfully kill them before being killed. While using the running and aiming mechanics, also called iron sights, which make guns more accurate in most FPS, the game's formula descends into a basic run, stop, aim, shoot formula, reducing the number of things the player does to one at a time. And while Resident Evil 4 used this mechanic because careful aiming was required, modern shooters have auto-aim features that make this process much simpler, reducing the gameplay of one of the most popular video game genres into something completely dumbed down. If we take into account that the same formula is used by most popular games on the market, the current industry ends up having a big problem. Sooner or later, all major games play the same, just because in a culture of mass media consumption, there's less time to learn complex mechanics of a game with depth than there is to play the same thing everybody's used to over and over again. And if the very essence of games is their interactive element to surpass a given challenge, that which defines them and differentiates them from the rest of all media, this means that the larger industry is not even creating new games to begin with. I'd also like to touch on the simplification and evolution of gameplay mechanics in different genres in recent times, but that's a topic for another video. Thank you for watching.